14 hours. That is all it took. 14 hours for one warship to humiliate the largest navy on Earth. 14 hours for one nation to announce without a single word spoken that the rules of the Indo-Pacific have changed forever. 14 hours that left a president of 1.4 billion people staring at his screens, unable to act, unable to respond, unable to do anything except send a spokesperson out to complain. 14 hours. Let that number sit for a moment. 841 warships. That is what China has. 841, the second largest total tonnage of any navy on the planet. Years of breakneck construction, billions upon billions of dollars poured into steel and sensors and missile systems, shipyard after shipyard grinding through the night, hull after hull sliding into the water, all to project one simple message to every nation in the region. Do not test us here. These are our waters. Stay out. The message was meant to be permanent. It was meant to be unchallengeable. It was meant to make every rival government in East Asia do the strategic math and decide that confrontation was not worth it. And then a single destroyer sailed in anyway and stayed for 14 hours and left whenever it wanted. Picture that for a moment. Not a fleet, not a carrier strike group, not some massive armada assembled over months of planning and diplomatic negotiation. One ship, one Japanese destroyer, threading through the Taiwan Strait, the most contested, most watched, most politically charged waterway in the world, as China's 841 warships sat in their berths and watched and did absolutely nothing. No intercept, no warning shots, no escort to the border. Nothing. This is not a small story. This is not a diplomatic footnote buried in the foreign affairs section. What Japan just did in that strait is the opening move of something much larger. And by the time this video is over, you will understand exactly why Beijing is more afraid tonight than it has been in years. You will understand why this single transit, by a single ship, on a single April morning, represents a collapse of the strategic logic that China has spent 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars constructing. This changes everything, and here is why. For decades, China has pursued what military analysts call a strategy of maritime saturation. The concept is elegant in its brutality. Build so many ships, so many missiles, so many submarines, that the psychological weight of Chinese naval power alone is enough to deter any rival from acting. You do not need to fire a single shot if the enemy is too terrified to move. You do not need to win battles you never have to fight. Every dollar China spent on its navy was not just buying hardware, it was buying silence. It was buying hesitation. It was buying the paralysis that keeps rival governments from making decisions that Beijing does not approve of. And it worked. For a long time, it worked extraordinarily well. Nation after nation in the Indo-Pacific calculated the odds and stepped back from the line. The South China Sea filled up with Chinese artificial islands, each one a military installation in everything but name. Chinese Coast Guard vessels began operating in waters claimed by Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia. China drew expansive lines on maps and dared the world to challenge them. And the world, by and large, flinched. Japan flinched with everyone else. Japan watched. Japan calculated. Japan stayed quiet. Tokyo looked at its own constitution, written in the ashes of the Second World War, and found Article 9 staring back at it. The Japanese people forever renounce war. That was the promise. That was the foundational principle of Japanese foreign policy for 80 years. Japan would defend its own territory, and nothing more. It would not project force. It would not send warships into contested waters. It would remain, in the language of international relations, a purely defensive state. A nation that had chosen pacifism not because it was weak, but because it had seen what war truly costs and wanted no part of it again. China counted on that. China built its entire regional strategy around that assumption. Tokyo would stay home. Japan would not interfere. The constitutional straitjacket was permanent, until now. The ship that Japan sent is called the JS Ikazuchi, and China had every reason to leave it alone. Commissioned in 2001, the Ikazuchi is not some aging relic patched together with obsolete systems and held together by institutional pride. It is a purpose-built fighting platform designed from the keel up for exactly the kind of confrontation China would never want to have. Its top speed sits at 30 knots, roughly 35 miles per hour, which sounds modest on paper, until you understand that a destroyer moving at that pace across open water is almost impossible to intercept before it reaches its objective. Speed at sea is not just about getting somewhere fast. It is about denying the enemy the reaction time they need to think, coordinate, and act. But the weapons are the real story. The Ikazuchi carries a 76mm main gun. It carries two 20mm close-in weapon systems, each capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute. 4,500. Those systems exist for one specific purpose: to shred incoming missiles before they reach the hull. They are the last line of defense, and they are terrifyingly effective. 8 anti-ship missiles sit in their launchers, each one capable of reaching out across the horizon and turning a rival warship into burning wreckage before the crew on that ship ever sees the threat coming. 2 torpedo tubes for subsurface threats, and 2 16-cell vertical launching systems, one of which carries evolved surface-to-air missiles that can engage aerial threats at extended range. This is not a ship that came to ask permission. This is a ship that came to make a point. Fully armed, fully crewed, fully capable of handling anything China might have thrown at it. And China knew it. That is precisely why China threw nothing. The silence from Beijing's fleet was deafening. No intercept, no attempt to shadow the Ikazuchi out of what China insists are its sovereign waters. Just the hum of Japanese engines as the destroyer made its 14-hour passage, turned, and left on its own terms. And then a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson stepping up to a podium to call the whole thing a display of force and a series of mistakes. An angry letter delivered after someone punched you in the jaw and walked away laughing. That is what 841 warships looked like when the moment of truth arrived. Not a show of strength, a confession of strategic impotence. But here's where it gets serious, because this was not a one-off event. The Ikazuchi's transit is the latest step in a sequence that has been building for years, each step a little louder than the last, each one watched closely by military analysts who have been tracking this shift with growing attention. Back in September of 2024, Japan broke its long-standing tradition entirely when the warship Sazanami made the first Japanese transit of the Taiwan Strait in the modern era. A historic moment that received relatively little coverage outside specialist circles. Then, in 2025, 2 more Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force vessels made the same journey. The drumbeat was getting louder. And now the Ikazuchi, operating under new Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, who took office in October of 2025. The timing embedded in that fact is almost too precise to miss. Japan just changed its head of government, and the very first Taiwan Strait transit under that new government was not a cautious, exploratory probe. It was a 14-hour demonstration conducted by one of Japan's most capable destroyers. New leadership, same resolve, same defiance, same silence from China. The message was not just to Beijing, it was to every capital in the region watching this unfold. Japan does not change its mind when it changes its government. Whatever China was hoping for from a new administration in Tokyo, a pause, a recalibration, a moment of strategic hesitation, it didn't get it. It got the Ikazuchi. And then Japan made its move. The transformation of Japan's military posture did not happen overnight. And that is precisely what makes it so significant. Overnight changes can be reversed. They can be chalked up to a moment of political bravado, a miscalculation, a provocation that will be walked back at the next diplomatic summit. What Japan has undergone is something fundamentally different. It is a slow, deliberate, structurally embedded reorientation of an entire national security doctrine. And it has been decades in the making. The first real crack in the constitutional armor appeared in 2015, when then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe pushed through legislation that stretched the interpretation of Article 9. Japan could now engage in what the law called collective self-defense, meaning that if a close ally were attacked in a way that threatened Japan's own survival, Japan could respond with military force beyond its own borders. The legal reasoning was careful and deliberately ambiguous, but the direction was unmistakable. Japan was preparing to act. Military analysts began calling it proactive pacifism, a philosophy that sounds gentle and measured and responsible, but which carries a very sharp edge when the circumstances are right. A decade later, the transformation has gone far beyond legal reinterpretation. Japan has launched its official security assistance program. The premise is straightforward. Japan provides Japanese-made defense equipment to nations that Tokyo considers like-minded. Nations that share Japan's values, and more to the point, nations that happen to face the same strategic pressures that Japan faces. In 2023, the program distributed $12.5 million in military aid. By 2024, that figure had grown to $31.2 million. In 2025, $44.3 million. And in 2026, the allocated budget stands at $116 million, more than double the previous year in a single step. Follow that curve forward. $12.5 million in year one, $116 million 3 years later. If the trajectory holds even roughly, Japan will be operating a military aid program worth several $100 million annually within the decade. And these are not random recipients. The nations receiving this equipment sit along the precise sea lanes that Japan considers vital to its trade and its security. The same sea lanes that China is systematically trying to bring under its control. Xi is watching a Japanese military-industrial partnership quietly arming the countries that stand in his way, one carefully targeted delivery at a time. So why does this matter? Because money follows strategy, and Japan's strategy has a name now, even if Tokyo has not given it one officially. It is the encirclement of Chinese maritime ambition, not through confrontation, through capacity building, through equipping every nation along China's intended routes of expansion with the tools to resist. The hardware investments at home are even more striking. Japan currently operates 48 modern destroyers, each one a platform comparable in capability to the Ikazuchi that just spent 14 hours making China look helpless. 48 destroyers is not a defensive coast guard. It is a force capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of open ocean. But the development that should concern Beijing most is what Japan has done with its helicopter carriers. The JS Izuno and the JS Kaga were originally classified as helicopter destroyer carriers, a designation chosen partly for constitutional reasons, since Japan was not supposed to operate offensive power projection platforms. That classification now belongs to history. Their flight decks have been reinforced and reconfigured, and they can each now carry between 12 and 15 F-35B stealth fighter jets. Think about what that means. Japan is operating fixed-wing stealth combat aircraft from aircraft carriers. That is a capability Japan has not possessed since the Second World War. The F-35B is not a defensive interceptor. It is a multi-role stealth platform capable of striking ground targets, engaging enemy aircraft beyond visual range, and suppressing air defenses hundreds of miles from the carrier, 12 to 15 of them on each ship. 2 ships, Japan just rewrote its own military biography, and the chapter heading is not self-defense anymore. That aerial firepower layered on top of 48 destroyers and an expanding network of armed partner nations gives Japan something that China's numerical advantage cannot simply overcome: strategic leverage at the precise geographic points that matter most. For China, here is the geographic reality that Beijing does not want anyone to focus on, because once you understand it, the entire architecture of Chinese regional strategy starts to look very fragile indeed. Japan is not simply a rival navy operating somewhere off in the distance. Japan is a physical wall. Look at a map of the Western Pacific. Japan's island chain does not sit neatly out of the way, up in the northeast corner where it can be safely ignored. It forms a continuous barrier, a chain stretching from the main Japanese islands south through Okinawa, through the Ryukyu chain, through the Miyako and Yaeyama island groups, all the way to the waters just north of Taiwan. Military and naval strategists have a name for this barrier. They call it the First Island Chain. And for China's Navy, it is not just a political concept drawn on a think tank map. It is a physical constraint with no workaround. If Chinese warships want to break out into the open Pacific, if they want to reach the deep water where American carrier groups operate, where the real strategic contest will be decided, they have to pass through that chain. There is no route around. There is only through. Now imagine a Taiwan invasion scenario. Walk through it step by step, because the geography is everything. China moves on Taiwan. American carrier strike groups begin moving west across the Pacific. China knows they are coming and needs to intercept them before they can bring their combat aircraft to bear on Chinese forces attacking Taiwan. To intercept those carriers, Chinese warships and submarines must transit through the First Island Chain, specifically through the Miyako Strait, a passage that runs between Okinawa and Miyako Island. Both are Japanese territory. Both are within range of Japanese land-based missile systems. And Japan, having already formally declared that a Chinese attack on Taiwan is a survival-threatening situation requiring a military response, would not simply wave Chinese warships through. Japan closes the strait. China cannot reach the Pacific. American carriers arrive. The entire Chinese invasion calculus collapses. Xi's only response to this is to try to force the strait open by attacking Japanese positions, which means attacking Japanese territory, which triggers every mutual defense understanding between Tokyo and Washington. China does not just fight Taiwan anymore. China fights Japan. China fights the United States. China fights both of them simultaneously while trying to execute the most complex amphibious assault operation in military history. No general staff on Earth would sign off on that operational plan. No war game run by serious analysts produces a Chinese victory from that starting position. And then there is Okinawa. Right now, the United States maintains multiple military installations on Okinawa. 80,000 Americans live on the island. Nearly 30,000 of them are active-duty military personnel drawn from every branch of the armed forces: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. They are not advisors. They are not contractors. They are combat troops, permanently stationed within the direct range of Chinese missile systems. Any Chinese strike on Japanese positions in the Miyako Strait would come perilously close to Okinawa. Any hit on Okinawa kills Americans, and the killing of Americans in a Chinese first strike removes every last shred of political ambiguity about whether the United States enters the war. Xi has spent years cultivating just enough uncertainty about American commitment to Taiwan. Would Washington really risk a nuclear exchange over an island it does not formally govern? The calculation was never certain. The doubt was the weapon. Okinawa eliminates that doubt entirely. China cannot bomb Japan without bombing American troops. America is at war, full stop. Xi walked into every element of this trap himself. For 40 days, between March and April of this year, China conducted naval blockade drills in the Taiwan Strait. 40 days of simulated stranglehold, designed to signal to Taiwan and its supporters that the invasion is not a distant theoretical threat, but an imminent operational reality that has been rehearsed and refined. That followed military exercises in December of 2025 that went even further, simulating not just a blockade, but the actual seizure of key locations inside Taiwan, involving People's Liberation Army ground forces alongside China's Navy, Air Force, and Rocket Force simultaneously. A full-scale rehearsal. All of it triggered, at least in part, by the United States approving an $11 billion weapons package for Taiwan, one of the largest in American history. So China drills its invasion. It practices its blockade. It rehearses its seizure operations. And it does all of this in plain view of Japan's intelligence apparatus, Japan's military planners, Japan's political leadership. Every drill is a lesson that Japan absorbs and incorporates. Every escalation confirms to Tokyo that the threat is real, that the timeline is shortening, and that the era of standing quietly on the sidelines is finished. China trained Japan to take it seriously, and then it complained when Japan took it seriously. The hypocrisy embedded in China's response to the Ikazuchi transit would be darkly comic if the stakes were not so high. Beijing's spokesperson stood at a podium and called Japan's peaceful 14-hour transit a threat to regional stability, a red line that should never have been crossed, an act that undermines the peace and security of the Taiwan Strait. This from a government that spent 40 consecutive days practicing a naval blockade in that exact waterway. This from a government whose military conducted full-scale invasion rehearsals 6 months ago. This from a government that has spent a decade militarizing artificial islands across the South China Sea, building runways and radar installations and missile batteries on features that international tribunals have ruled it has no right to occupy. China gets to practice strangling Taiwan, but Japan does not get to sail a destroyer past it. The statement was not diplomacy. It was theater, and every government watching understood precisely what it was. China has also tried to push back on Japan through other means in recent months, which only underscores how rattled Beijing has become by Tokyo's new assertiveness. In February of this year, China dispatched a fishing fleet of more than 20 vessels into Japan's exclusive economic zone. An exclusive economic zone extends roughly 200 nautical miles from a nation's territorial waters, granting that nation jurisdiction over the resources found within it. China sailing more than 20 boats into that zone was not about fish. It never is. The ships were there to probe, to assert presence, to test Japan's willingness to respond with more than a formal diplomatic protest. Japan responded with helicopters and water cannons. Military attack helicopters were scrambled. Patrol vessels moved to intercept. The Chinese fleet was pushed out of Japanese waters without ceremony. No extended diplomatic back and forth, no softening language, a direct, proportional response that told Beijing in terms that required no translation. Do not mistake our restraint for weakness. The contrast with the Ikazuchi transit is almost too stark to be real. China pushes into Japanese waters and gets expelled. Japan sails through Chinese-claimed waters and gets 14 hours of uninterrupted passage, followed by an angry press release. The asymmetry is not subtle. It is the entire story told in 2 sentences. The ripples from all of this are already spreading in ways that she cannot control. On the 20th of April, 3 days after the Ikazuchi transit, China dispatched warships to conduct exercises in the Pacific. The timing was transparently deliberate. The United States, Japan, and the Philippines had just commenced their own joint military exercises, and Beijing wanted to send a counter-message. China, too, can project naval power. China, too, can operate in the open Pacific. The exercises were meant to look formidable. They did not look formidable because, while China was conducting unilateral drills designed to project the image of strength, Japan was training alongside the United States and the Philippines, building the kind of interoperable, battle-tested, multinational alliance capability that unilateral exercises cannot replicate, no matter how many ships you send. Every hour Japan spends training with American and Filipino forces is an hour invested in an alliance that will still be functioning, coordinated, and lethal when the crisis actually comes. Every drill China conducts alone deepens its isolation. Xi can see that math. He cannot stop it. The reverberations reach all the way to Moscow. On the 15th of April, 2 days before the Ikazuchi entered the Taiwan Strait, Vladimir Putin dispatched 2 frigates and a supply vessel from Russia's Pacific Fleet to make a port visit in China. The optics were carefully constructed. Xi is not isolated. Russia stands with China. The two nations are building a strategic partnership that the Western alliance and its Asian partners cannot simply wave away. It was a show, staged for an audience of nervous governments in the region who might be considering which side to back. And then Japan sent an ultra-modern destroyer through the Taiwan Strait 48 hours later. And the contrast did all the work that words could not. Russia's aging Pacific Fleet frigates making a courtesy call in a Chinese harbor. Japan's purpose-built, fully armed, stealth-capable destroyer conducting a 14-hour demonstration of operational will in front of the entire world. Putin noticed. The governments watching noticed. The partnership being built between Beijing and Moscow looks very different when you hold it next to the partnership being exercised by Tokyo, Washington, and Manila at exactly the same moment. There is one final dimension to this story that deserves to be stated plainly. Japan just gave every nation in the Indo-Pacific that is quietly watching China's rise with growing alarm a proof of concept. It demonstrated that it is possible to transit the Taiwan Strait. It demonstrated that China will not respond militarily. It demonstrated that the language about sovereign waters and red lines and chains of mistakes is at the decisive moment exactly that, language. Other navies were watching. Other governments were calculating. The nations receiving Japan's official security assistance were watching. The Philippines, locked in its own escalating confrontation with China in the South China Sea, was watching. Taiwan was watching. South Korea was watching. And every single one of them saw the same thing. China blinked. That precedent is worth more than any individual weapon system. Deterrence is built on credibility. Credibility is built on demonstrated willingness to act. Japan just demonstrated it. 14 hours of it. And China's 841 warships provided the backdrop. Xi came to the Indo-Pacific believing he had already won. He built a navy meant to make opposition unthinkable. He staged drills meant to make Taiwan's supporters flinch. He sent fishing fleets into Japanese waters to probe Tokyo's nerve. He rehearsed invasions in full view of the nations he was trying to intimidate, calculating that the spectacle of Chinese military power would be enough to break their will before a single shot was fired. He was wrong on every count. 1 destroyer, 14 hours, 0 response from 841 warships. That is the real balance of power in the Taiwan Strait right now. Not what China projected. Not what Xi promised his generals when he told them the fleet they built would make the Indo-Pacific bend to Beijing's will. Not what Chinese state media will tell its citizens happened that April morning. The operational reality, the thing that cannot be reframed or buried under angry press releases or walked back at the next diplomatic summit. The giant that China spent 2 decades assuming would never wake up, just sailed through the front door, stayed for 14 hours, and turned on every light in the house. And somewhere in Beijing, 841 warships did nothing about it. If you found value in this, subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next.